Bueno, mientras se siguen conectando, darles la bienvenida a todas, a todos. Este es el segundo día del simposio de INFORMAS. Este es un evento organizado por Colanza, por la red INFORMAS, con el patrocinio de IDRC. Estamos muy contentos. Ayer tuvimos una sesión muy activa, con mucha participación, con mucha discusión. Esperamos que hoy día podamos seguir intercambiando experiencias, resultados en relación a entornos alimentarios más saludables. Invitarlas a que se inscriban en las sesiones que vienen a continuación de abstracts. Y al final de la jornada tenemos también dos excelentes discusiones, presentaciones en las cuales pueden participar y no olvidarse de volver para la finalización y el cierre de este simposio. Para comenzar, tengo el placer de presentar a la profesora Jessica Fanzo. Ella es directora de la unidad de Food Systems y Ethics de Bloomberg, de la Escuela de Bloomberg de Salud Pública. Ella tiene un currículum extenso, codirigió el Global Nutrition Report por varios años, dirigió también el Comité de Alta Investigación de Naciones Unidas y actualmente es probablemente de las personas que más reflexión y investigación ha hecho en la interfase entre sistemas alimentarios, entornos, ambiente y dietas, por lo que para nosotros es un honor tenerla presentando esta charla inaugural de este simposio. Y los invito y las invito a que le hagan muchísimas preguntas, porque efectivamente creo que ella ha hecho un proceso que es muy interesante para nuestra región y tenemos muchas cosas que compartir y discutir con ella. Así que bienvenida y le dejo la palabra a Jessica.
Gracias, Camila. Buenas tardes to everyone. That's about the extent of my Spanish. Thank you so much for joining and for having for the invitation to be able to present some new work that
la invitación y es un
other colleagues. I'll share my screen. Okay. So today I thought I would present on something called the Food Systems Countdown to 2030 initiative, as well as the integration of that initiative and the work we're doing with the food systems dashboard, and to deepen the conversation around integrating the work that you are all doing with INFORMAS and some of the indicators and metrics that are being collected as part of the fantastic INFORMAS project. So why are we doing this work on improving metrics or food system science? Well, it's really to improve decision-making. Policymakers are often navigating in the dark on how their food systems are performing, what are the potential near and long-term risks, and where they can act and intervene. And by having more data tools, metrics, models, global guidance, we hope that it brings policymakers into the light where they can understand and unpack some of the most complex food system science issues that countries face. So we hope that some of the work that we're doing along with INFORMAS is informing policy, it's informing programs towards improvements like improving diets, nutrition and health, climate change and environment, and equitable livelihoods. And there's a lot happening in the food space. We've had a lot of global commitments the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Food Systems Summit, the COP meetings, decades of family farming, decades of action on nutrition. But how do we increase the accountability of these moments and these global goal setting endeavors to ensure that we hold policymakers to account? I think many of you know food systems play a role in every sustainable development goal, all 17. Food is central to all of them. Food is also vulnerable to many of the actions taken across the SDGs. But what was established in 2015 in achieving these 17 goals, which every country agreed upon, we only have 8 years left. So how are we doing on food systems, which SDG 2 is central to this agenda? How are we doing on achieving the goals set out with the SDGs? We're not that far away from achieving that, from reaching the endpoint, but quite far from actually achieving them. So there's been a lot of calls to transform food systems, ensuring that food systems are meeting many of their environment, human health, and livelihood goals. But to really track food system transformation, it requires clear, rigorous indicators to guide decision makers, to guide policymakers, and hold them accountable. And that set of indicators needs to cover all aspects of food systems and their interactions. So we need a whole framework of metrics to be able to really track transformation. But no real rigorous mechanism exists. And Professor Boyd Swinburne, who's on this call, has been arguing for that for a long time, that we need more accountability. We need more mechanisms to track food systems change. And of course, we need those metrics, but decision makers need science-based metrics and assessments that are trustworthy. Food system actors and stakeholders, whether it's civil society, international organizations, NGOs, also require trustworthy metrics to hold those in power to account. So we need a better mechanism. Now, one thing that we're doing is this Food Systems Countdown Initiative, which we think is one tool of many to try to fill this gap of an accountability mechanism. The Food Systems Countdown Initiative will be publishing an annual assessment that will provide actionable evidence to track progress, guide decision makers, and inform transformation. And we hope that it complements other monitoring and tracking of related goals at the global and regional level, and that includes INFORMAS. Right now, we've got about 55 collaborators from 31 organizations representing all regions of the world, representing different areas of work, academia, the United Nations, the CGIAR, NGOs, CSOs, and government. And these collaborators have come together and set out a vision of what this countdown report would look like. And here's where we are. We published a framework paper last year, really outlining what this countdown would look like. And every year we'll be publishing a report. At the end of this year will be the first report where we've selected indicators and we present the data on those indicators of what we call the state of food systems. In the following year, we'll do performance of food systems, and I'll come back to that. And each year leading up to 2030, we'll have a report and we'll have a couple of conferences, and I hope you all join those conferences, leading to a final, culminating paper on the last 8 years and the future of food systems in 2030. Our first paper was published in Food Policy. It's really calling for rigorous monitoring to guide food system transformation towards 2030. And in that paper, we articulated our architecture, how we as a collaborative align ourselves. And so we have collaborators working across 5 areas. 3 are in the outcomes of food systems. So diets, nutrition, and health, environment and climate, livelihoods, poverty, and equity. And then 2 cross-cutting themes on governance and resilience and sustainability. And within each of these thematic areas, we have indicator domains. So for example, in diets, nutrition, and health, we have indicator domains of diet quality, food security, food environments, and policies affecting food environments. And the groups are aligning indicators to each of these domains. Oops. So right now we're moving towards this baseline report. And to get there, we've had to do a few different things. We've had 3 different entry points for data. One is our collaborators coming together and vetting indicators and taking these indicators through a criteria process. We also asked for an expert consultation of experts in food systems measurement to look at the indicators that we've chosen, a longer list of indicators, and evaluate those. And we had regional consultations that were hosted by FAO, which brought together about 500 people collectively across the 5 regions that FAO recognizes, and they met to discuss the indicators. And what we're doing is looking through these 3 processes to come up with a final selection of about 40 indicators to track over the next 8 years. The expert consultation process that we went through, that was asking for experts who understand food system measurement to look at our longer list of indicators. We had 98 indicators. We asked them to look at these, and you can see the range numbers of indicators across our 5 domains. We have a lot on diets and food environments and food security, and a lot on resilience, interestingly. Not as many on things like livelihoods, but these were the 98 indicators that expert people had looked at. Our expert consultation was made up of different geographic affiliations. You can see here where people sit. We also looked at what people chose to evaluate. Many people were very interested in evaluating diets and nutrition. And not a lot of people, many less people wanting to do livelihoods, a more difficult area. We had a pretty solid makeup of gender, more women, and years of experience. Most people had more than 10 years, and most people had a PhD, and that was the expert consultation. We asked them to vet our indicators, looking at the relevance, the quality, the interpretability, and the importance of those indicators. And we'll be publishing that with the baseline report. We also had an FAO regional consultation where policymakers, or those working in policy, really examined the indicators and their usefulness, and the usefulness of the countdown project. And they deliberated on this over some workshops, and they came up with a range of issues of importance and regional priorities. And I'm happy to discuss more of those. Of course, there's a wide ranging view of what's the most important attributes of food systems to measure. And of course, the regional priorities differ based on the challenges that each region, and within that, each country face when it comes time to food systems. It's not a singular challenge, but there's many different challenges depending on the context. In the following year, next year, we'll be publishing a paper taking those core set of indicators and putting thresholds to those indicators of what we call food performance. So it's one thing to say, this is what your food system looks like. It's another thing to say, this is how your food system is performing. These are the challenged areas. These are countries doing well, to solicit action on those challenge areas. So one thing we did as part of the food systems dashboard group, we came up with a set of diagnostics in which we took 39 indicators that were macro indicators that cut across a range of issues of food systems, from different food system components and food system outcomes, and created thresholds for those indicators to assess how food systems are performing. And this is showing you, and I'm sorry it's small, and the top, these first 4 quadrants is supply chain indicators, food environment indicators, nutrition outcomes, and environmental outcomes of food systems. Down here on the 4 buckets of countries, it's low to high income countries. And below you can see the 39 indicators. The red is a likely challenge area. The green is an unlikely challenge area, or doing well. The yellow is on the borderline, potentially a challenge area, and gray is missing data. If you just look at this lower right quadrant, this is a set of high income countries, and it's looking at environmental indicators. So greenhouse gas emissions coming from agriculture, water use coming from agriculture, eutrophication, biodiversity loss. And you can see overall, when you look at the color of high income countries, they're not doing very well on environmental indicators. Whereas up here on the top right, this is low income countries, they're actually doing better on some of these environmental indicators. So what this allows for you to do is take a temperature check of a country's food system and see where there could be potential challenged areas and to take action on those challenged areas. So what we're doing now is, beyond just publishing papers, we want to make all of this countdown work available, and we're integrating it into the food systems dashboard, as well as FAO Stat. FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization's main database, where there's a lot of data for over 245 countries. Now, the dashboard is a partnership between Johns Hopkins University and the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, in which it brings together over 200 indicators across food systems, thinking about food supply chains, food environments, individual factors, drivers of food systems change, and outcomes of food systems change. And again, it's to bring data together in one place to make data easy to understand and visually appealing for better decision making. So here's just a map showing you roughly the kind of indicators we have across different elements of food systems. So about 31 indicators for food supply, 45 indicators across food environments, 0 for consumer behavior. And I'm happy to talk about why that is. There's a good reason. But what we try to do is pick indicators where most countries have data. Now, there's a lot of data out there, but it's for a couple of high income countries. So we want high quality data, but data that's equitable. It's geographically distributed and available in every country. This is just to give you a quick example of what the food systems dashboard looks like. We're relaunching the dashboard this September. It's going to be much more visually and interactive with a new launch, but you can look at indicators and look at maps. You can look at bar graphs and line charts and do all kinds of analysis using the data. We also have country profiles. So instead of you going into the food systems dashboard and playing with the data, this is just a snapshot of a country's food system, and it shows you a whole set of indicators. And what we're doing is integrating the countdown indicators, what will be the final list of indicators, into these country profiles. And there'll be diagnostics, which you can see here, where we not only show the current state of that data or the trend data, but how are they doing? Is it a challenged area, or is it in the green or is it in the red? From there, what we're doing is taking those diagnostics, and this is showing you again these 39 indicators across low to high income countries. And this is just a summary table showing you the more challenged areas, the darker red. And what we're doing now is using machine learning to link those diagnostics to actions, to policy actions. And we're starting with the 42 actions that Corinna Hawks, Lawrence Haddad, Stephanie Walton, and myself worked on. And we're developing how to link those diagnostics to policy actions with machine learning or artificial intelligence. So as data gets updated, as diagnostics change, because things can improve, things can get worse, the actions will change, and we'll be doing that with machine learning. So that's sort of our next step over the next year to do some of that work. The other thing the countdown will be doing is looking at trade-offs. There's a lot of trade-offs with food systems. What's, integrating or emphasizing one area of the food system or investing in one area of the food system could have impacts on other parts of the system. So how do you start even looking and analyzing and measuring trade-offs in food systems? This is where system science gets very complex. When we think about the food system, the sheer number of feedback loops, positive and negatively, or trade-offs and synergies becomes very complex of how you measure those dynamics. Some work we're doing with Chris Bene is trying to look at these trade-offs. And this is on the right is showing you a correlation matrix of different food system indicators and measuring the sustainability of food systems. And we do that through these correlation or associations of different indicators and how they relate to each other. This is the very beginning of thinking about the relationships of some of these components and what the data is telling us about positive and negative associations, which could lead to more articulation of policy trade-offs. So that's work that we're just starting, but will take a bit of time to do. So again, the countdown, we'll be doing annual assessments. We will have a 2023 event, most likely, alongside the UN FSS follow-up, and then a larger capstone event in a few years after the tracking takes place. I wanted to just end with just one other thing that I think is interesting to work on and can aid in decision-making. And it's really developing what we call food typologies, in which we classify and group countries into different types. And what you often see, and what I showed earlier, was income classification, low to high income. But that's, of course, very crude. One thing that we developed with the food systems dashboard, and this is building on Rachel Nugent's work from the Global Nutrition Report published in 2015, is we took 4 indicators: agriculture value added per worker, share of dietary energy from staples, supermarket density, and urban population, and grouped countries into these 5 food system typologies: rural and traditionals in black, informal expanding in yellow, emerging and diversifying in blue, modern and formalizing in green, and then industrialized in pink. So for example, in rural, you can see places in East Africa are still quite rural and traditional food systems, whereas America is a very industrialized food system. So I want to caveat by saying, of course, subnationally, food systems are very heterogeneous. You know, there's very rural food systems in the United States and very industrialized food systems. There's very rural informal food environments and more industrialized food environments. So we recognize that these typologies have a lot of limitations, but it does allow for you to cross compare with countries and see, as countries transition and change and their food systems change, what are some of the lessons that places that are rural, as they economically grow, what are some of the things that they can avoid that industrialized countries have made mistakes on with their food systems? This is just showing you, using those 5 typologies from rural to industrial, you can see trends. This is showing you vegetable intake in adults. This red meat's a pretty classic one. Rural places, rural countries, rural food systems are rural dominated countries are consuming a lot less red meat than very industrialized countries. It's your classic pattern. Anemia much higher in rural traditional food system compared to industrialized. Obesity much lower in rural areas, although that's changing very rapidly to more of the modernizing and industrialized having much more prevalence of obesity. Here's showing you some environmental indicators. The ecological footprint of food production goes up with industrialization. Water use goes up. Eutrophication goes up as well. So this is just showing you some of these classic patterns of these food system typologies. Another thing we did using these typologies is we just looked at transitions over time. And this is showing you the percentage of the population who cannot afford a recommended diet. And in rural systems, you see a significant percentage of the population can't afford a healthy diet compared to industrialized. And this is showing you, again, an environmental indicator that per capita emissions coming from food goes up much more as countries industrialized. And so the thing here is, how can these rural and traditional systems avoid this pattern as they grow and as their food system becomes more and more modernized? This is just another example showing you the 5 food system types and greenhouse gas emissions coming from different aspects of the food system: production, processing, packaging, transport. You can see the different colors. And again, where greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, and just looking at rural versus industrialized here at the bottom, you see that greenhouse gas emissions are coming from all segments of the food supply chain in industrialized food systems, where in rural, most of the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from production and land use change, which is shown in the gray. So gives you interesting insights on where countries are and how they can leapfrog over some of the mistakes that industrialized or modernized food systems have undergone. One of my colleagues, Shauna Downs, has done the same thing for food environments. She's developed some food environment typologies, wild food environments, cultivated food environments, informal and formal food environments. And she's not only created these 4 typologies, but has articulated the types of food environments you would see in these 4 different food environment types. So obviously wild is going to be things like forests, rivers, natural lakes, seas, ponds, disturbed habitat, open pastures, whereas a very formal market is hypermarkets, supermarkets, restaurants, online vendors. And I find this typology really interesting because it allows for you to see the entry points of where you could potentially improve on these food environments, depending on where you are. And this figure is showing you, she mapped the food environment transition to the nutrition transition, and what kind of food environments you would typically find in these different patterns, from more agrarian society, what you'd find deeply in sub-Saharan Africa, rural Africa, to places like in the United States or Mexico here with the more developed urban type of setting. And she's also done a bit of work looking at, this was just published a couple weeks ago, looking at these different food environments and looking at the value of some of these market types, to understand how they've changed over time. So looking at transitions over time and showing that the retail value of some of these different food environments across different socio-demographic indices, you see the growth of supermarkets and hypermarkets and modern markets, which less growth in traditional markets. And I will end there, and I look forward to the discussion and the rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Le vamos a dar las gracias a Jessica. Vamos a pasar a sesión de preguntas. Pueden hacer las preguntas por el chat. No nos animamos a hacer preguntas.
Wow. I hope everyone could understand me. I'm sorry I don't speak Spanish.
We could take some reactions from the panel while we wait.
Vamos a ver, hay algunas reacciones, pero antes.
So I have a question, actually, and you may have covered this, Jess, in your presentation, but just thinking about data sources. So am I correct in understanding that this is mostly from more centralized sources, including the large international organizations that are already working across countries?
Yeah, so most of the data we'll pull is from global sources, data that's available. But maybe from less traditional sources as well for the food world. So for example, the governance group is looking at a lot of indices and how can they retrofit some of these indices for food. So some of our indicators will be very traditional and tracked yearly by FAO. Some will be newer data coming down the pike, like the Gallup poll diet data, because Anna Herforth is leading that work and she's leading our diet group. And then some new indicators are being developed, particularly by the resilience group. So doing a bit of a mixture of both, but some of the new indicator development, of course, won't be available for a couple of years while the collaboration establishes those. I think the one area that we struggle most, well, the two areas we struggle most with on indicators is the governance group. There's not a lot of governance data on food systems, and the livelihoods group. You know, just getting numbers around how many people work in the food system. Very hard to track and measure. And IFAD just had a meeting about that this past week, because so many people work informally in the food system and they're just not counted. So really understanding some of those details, I think, will take some time. So I don't want to say that the countdown's not exciting, because it's not that it is about coming up with a whole new set of metrics and no one's going to be able to access those. It's going to be metrics that we may all know, but it will have gone through 3 vetting processes of what's considered the highest quality data with what we have now. And what data is and what indicators are the best to track over the next several years. So.
Thanks, Jess. I think there's a couple questions in the chat that sort of build on this and this complementarity, I suppose, that INFORMAS researchers can have at the national level in their monitoring with complementing these high-level indicators, combining them and including them in national dashboards and monitoring systems for greater impact on decision making.
Yeah, maybe I could say one thing on the national monitoring systems and ensuring that they are advocated for. One of the conundrums that we have is that many countries have their own SDG tracking systems. So they're tracking SDG 2. These indicators, when they were established in 2015, don't address our current knowledge of food systems. For example, there's no diet indicator in the SDG 2. There's no childhood obesity. Well, is there childhood obesity, Camilla? I think there is. Yes, Boyd? Yeah, there is. There's not adult, I think, right? Adult overweight and obesity. There's not, when you look at the SDG 2 ag and food system indicators, there's very little. It's mainly production indicators. So we hope that this set of indicators that we choose, along with things like INFORMAS, becomes part of the monitoring systems beyond just the SDG monitoring systems for countries, or complements those systems. But it would be wonderful for these indicators to be tracked by countries and integrated into their national information systems. It would be fantastic. And if we could collect that at the subnational level, that would be even better. But yeah, countries are already asked to track a lot, and that's a bit of the problem. They're being asked to track a whole lot of data, and some of it really not useful for action. So how do we not make that more burdensome for them? That's a big question. But on the UN Food System Summit, countries are now on creating these roadmaps for food systems transformation. They're going to need a sophisticated set of indicators to track that transformation. And what does that look like? And some of that will be INFORMAS, is like I would say, because they need to understand what's happening across their food environments. So I think Boyd wants to say something. Hopefully not disagree with me, but compliment what I'm saying.
Thanks, Jess. Boyd always wants to say something. First of all, this is just wonderful. Every time I hear you speak, it's a whole nother set of graphics and ways to depict things, which I think is fantastic. Learning a lot, I'm sure, from the global burden of disease and the sort of graphics that are useful at a national level. So that's fantastic. So there's two areas, I think, at this intersection between what you're doing and the INFORMAS work and what you've touched on, and there's a few questions in the chat related to that, is how the work and the data that have been collected in INFORMAS can feed into the indicators. Mm-hmm. And my guess is that you kind of need a pretty largish number of countries to be able to pull indicators in. So I'd like to kind of hear about that. There's about 60 some countries, I guess, involved in INFORMAS. So maybe we need 160. I don't know what your magic number is, but there is that issue around data input. But then there's also the issue around the use and how these data get utilized at a national level. And one of the huge strengths, I think, of the INFORMAS groups in every country is that they are connected, they're doing this work and so on. And so bringing in the dashboard data and using that at a national level for advocacy and for ongoing activity and research and so on, and trying to get action, that seems to me to be a real strength. So yeah, I just wonder if you comment on the kind of the number of countries you're needing and to be able to include an indicator into the dashboard, and also the mechanisms by which these can be sort of amplified the data can be amplified at a national level through the INFORMAS network. Kia ora.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the number, we were trying to go for, at least 80% of countries are represented, but we're seeing that with the countdown, we're really going to struggle with high quality indicators. So for example, the Gallup poll dietary quality data, that team will have about 45 countries by the year end, and we're going to track that data in a countdown. And so that's sufficient, Boyd, for the countdown, I think, at this stage. So we're getting a little bit more lenient. What I want to avoid is where it becomes just a set of high income countries. So, and with INFORMAS, you don't have that, right? You've got middle and I think even low income countries now. And we have people on INFORMAS in our group. We have Simone from Mexico, who's on the governance group, and we have Amos on the diet group. And so I think they've been pushing a bit on including some of the tracking from INFORMAS into the countdown. I would love to, again, Boyd, we've talked about it in the past, now that the dashboard's a little bit further along and INFORMAS is growing and growing, it would be great to come back together at the INFORMAS and the dashboard teams and see how we can work together on integrating them and how we can share some of the work that you're doing on the dashboard and vice versa. I think more us sharing your stuff. I don't know if our stuff is as useful to INFORMAS. It's pretty broad, and but and you're right. I think the dashboard work really becomes useful when countries start to deliberate on the dashboard and look at the diagnostics and start having conversations and workshopping what are the actions they could take to potentially address some of the challenges. But most countries are asking for subnational dashboards. It's the national level just is not so helpful, particularly in large countries like Brazil and India. National data is pretty useless. So GAIN has started doing some work with 6 countries to build subnational dashboards, but it becomes really challenging from a data perspective of what kind of data is available at the subnational level and the quality of that data. But there's going to be undertaking work in Nigeria, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, I think maybe Kenya, and I cannot remember the 6th one. But yeah, so the workshopping is fine, but a lot of countries are wanting more subnational data, and I would argue more real-time data. Like the whole Ukraine-Russia crisis. This is such a great example of the global food system is changing on a daily basis, right? Food prices, fodder prices, fertilizer prices, export bans, protectionism. It's changing so quickly. It's hard to keep up with what's happening and what's being substituted for wheat and safflower and all the other commodities. We don't have really good real-time data across a range of food system issues of supply chains, and it's really problematic. So
thanks, Jess. That's fantastic. I better hand back to Camilla because she can moderate some of the questions coming through, especially the ones in Spanish. Might have to do a little bit of translation for you, Jess. But yeah, thanks for that. And listen, we really do look forward to continued integration between what you're doing and the INFORMAS network.
Can I just say really quick, sorry, Camilla, I had asked Boyd, I said, can you send me the INFORMAS indicators? And that was a very long email. I mean, the INFORMAS is actually incredible, the amount of data and subset of data pieces that you've collected. It's really amazing. And how can we better pull that together into the dashboard? It's just tremendous. Anyway.
Yeah, so we will take some of the questions in the chat. There is one that is asking about domestic environments and whether there is some intention to collect measurements at that level. Basically, for example, what's the availability of time, or how do you measure the interaction between people and these food environments?
Oh. No, yeah, no, that a great question. We have very little data on the people piece of food systems, on the people's behavior, whether it's a farmer or it's an eater. We have very little information about behaviors, interactions with people's lives, how they live their lives, and their relationships with food environments. And INFORMAS probably has a lot more information on that. But when we tried to get information around individual behaviors, very little data, lots of great publications on that, but not across countries, not agreed upon global indicators of consumer behavior, for example. Most of that data sits with private sector and they don't publish it, and it's proprietary. And we'd probably have issues if we did publish private sector data. We'd get a lot of criticism. So I think that's it's a great question, but one that we don't, as far as I know, and it'd be good to hear from INFORMAS of what kind of data you have on that, but we don't have, I don't think we have any of that kind of data. But that's kind of the key, right? Is how do people engage with all of this? We don't know that, right? Why do people make certain choices? How do they come to that? And what's their constraints? And this is such a difficult space of not really, every experience is contextualized based on a range of constraints. Yeah.
So I would say that INFORMAS doesn't collect that data either. So no answer from INFORMAS there. So probably an area in which someone else can kind of start to develop some data. There is another question asking how defining this food system or using this food system or food environment typology differs from using an economic classification. And maybe I could add, or an ultra processed food classification. So can you comment?
Great question. That's from Jonas. Great question. Very much aligns. Very much aligns. You have a few countries kind of going in and out of the different classifications, but it really does kind of follow that trajectory of economic growth, Jonas. So yeah, it's very similar, but it's just, but it shows you the patterns of how food systems, how interesting it does align with GDP in a sense, right? But the food environment typology is more nuanced, but it also sort of aligns with income classification, interestingly. So it says something about those two relationships in a broader context.
We have another question from Nadia. She's asking more about the diet component of the dashboard. And she asked whether there is a plan to collect dietary intakes when available, or levels or critical nutrients in the food supply.
Yeah. So Nadia, we are, right now we have the global burden of disease diet data on the dashboard. And we are going to be replacing that with the diet quality Gallup poll data as that starts to become available. And that's agreed upon by the dashboard team. The countdown team will track the diet quality data. As far as nutrients and the critical nutrients in the food supply, we do track different food groups, of production of different food groups, the supply, meaning importation and production, subtracting out exportation. We look at loss of different food groups, and we mark that down by fruits, veg, nuts, legumes, oils, so it's divided more that way, but we don't look at singular nutrients in the food supply, although we could, because there's several databases that do track that. Mario Herrero does some of that work of looking at how nutrients flow through the food supply and where do they come from and where do they go to. And some interesting work that came out a few years ago, I was on this paper, showed that global trade is critically important in moving nutrients around the world. And if we didn't have global trade, we'd have a lot of deficiencies, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, trade brings with it all the bad food too, all the ultra-processed foods, unfortunately. And it's all coming from where I'm sitting right now in the United States. But anyway, but yeah, so we don't track the nutrients of this food supply. We track more of the foods, and that all comes from FAO stat. Yeah.
We have maybe the last question is again related to ultra processed foods and how this relates to the typology that you have defined, and whether you would say that some typology is more related to ultra processed food access, and yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, it's a great question. And when you look across the typology,
sí, claro. Cuando miramos las tipologías,
line of showing that some of rural places not having it was retail sales of ultra processed foods. Maybe I can just show one quick slide for the group, because I think this group is of course very interested in ultra processed, and then I'll stop. But something that we did where you can see here are the 5 typologies, and this is showing you retail value of ultra processed foods per capita is the bubble size, right? So retail value of ultra processed food sales per capita. This x-axis is consumption expenditure per capita, and the y-axis is adult obesity. So you see this classic trend of association between industrialized and consolidated countries with increased obesity and the sales of ultra processed foods. But one question is, what happens? For example, why do Argentina and Spain have lower per capita retail sales of ultra processed foods compared to other countries in the same category, industrialized and consolidated? Why is that happening? Why are their sales lower in those 2 countries in the same typology? And that's what these typologies allow for you to look at. They allow you to look at comparisons. And opposite, why do Bolivia and Myanmar have higher per capita retail sales of ultra processed food compared to other countries in another food system typology, the informal and expanding food system? What's happening here in these countries? So what allows you to look at data, comparable countries, and ask some questions. What's happening? Is this data correct? And if it is, what's going on in the policy space there? What's going on in the programmatic space to see those positive and negative deviances? So that's what I think the typologies is best for, is really to do those comparisons and start asking more questions and potentially, hopefully answering them.
Okay, so I think we had a great discussion, conversation. I heard that there is more to come from combining INFORMAS to the dashboard. So hope we can all contribute into that. And we will end this session by thanking Jess for sharing all the excellent work they are doing, and for inspiring us, because I think we need to learn on how to present the data and how to make it useful for policymakers here in Latin America. So thank you very much.